Welcome back to another episode of the Kings Pulse podcast presented by the Kings Herald. My name is Brendan Nunez, and today I have Matt George of ABC 10 and the Locked On Kings podcast joining me. What's going on, Matt? How you doing, man?
I'm good, Brendan. It was so good last night. I know you feel the same way to be in the Golden One Center for actual Kings basketball. Maybe it doesn't count because it's preseason, but regardless, seeing the Kings play on their home hardwood again, it makes you excited and even more impatient for the real Kings versus Blazers coming up here in a handful of days.
Yeah, hard to not feel good about it. We're recording this one the day after the Kings had their, like you pointed out, preseason home opener against the Portland Trail Blazers. Before we go into specifics of the game, just to get the injuries out of the way and guys that were unavailable, Richaun Holmes didn't play with a non-COVID related illness. Doesn't seem like there's anything long-term concerning there. My understanding, I think it's just some sort of stomach bug that's going on. It'd be nice to see Richaun get into a little bit of a rhythm, but he was not available. And then on Portland's side, there was no Gary Payton II, who is recovering from some sort of core injury. And then Justice Winslow was out with also a non-COVID related illness. So, Matt, coming into game two, what were some of the things that you were keeping an eye on after we had seen the debut in LA?
Well, really quick, too, I do want to say it's a bummer that Richaun didn't play in last night's game because it was such a good team overall performance, especially offensively, but they did great things defensively that I wanted to see what Richaun looked like because I think Richaun would have had a lot of success. I thought Alex Len played very, very well coming off the bench in that backup big role because Richaun is out. That is Richaun's spot. And then even Neemias Queta got to some playing time at the end of the game, which I don't think he would have gotten had Richaun been healthy. I think that would have been Alex Len's spot there. And he played really, really well. I think it was hard to be a Sacramento Kings, step on the floor last night and not vibe with what the Sacramento Kings were doing as a whole, as a team. So it's a bummer because I think Richaun would have shined and given us quite a few highlights last night. But heading into the game, Brendan, honestly, I was one of the main things I was looking for and one of the main things I was happy to see was the fact that KZ Okpala was starting again. Even though I'm not a fan of that decision, even though I think it's Keegan Murray's spot that KZ is just keeping warm at this point. I'm glad that Mike gave it more than just one game sample size. Like I wanted to see multiple games of what it looked like. And this game, while it's not a completely accurate representation of what rotations are going to look like for the regular season, when he cuts his rotation down to probably 9 or 10 guys, it was at least a little more realistic than playing 20 guys in Los Angeles, right? So I wanted to see what KZ Okpala would look like. One, guarding Damian Lillard out of the gate, which he did. And two, in a bit larger of a sample size. However, which I'm sure we'll talk about, he still didn't play a whole heck of a lot in the first half, which is a little bit telling to me, but also, like I said, we'll discuss that. But I was definitely looking for that. I was hoping to see a little more of De'Aaron Fox and Malik Monk together, and we got extremely limited stretches of the two of them together. Malik would come into the game, Fox would still be in, and like the next dead ball, Fox would sub out and vice versa. So I wanted to see a little more of that, but really I just wanted to see consistencies carry over from the successes of game one into game two. The team running in transition, the team moving the basketball, moving off of the ball. I wanted to see a consistent focus, overall just a consistent way of playing the game from LA to Portland. I didn't want to see them look completely different. Even if it looked sharper, I wanted to see things that look the same because I think consistency is going to be one of the keys to Sacramento actually achieving their peak this year. So those were the main things that I was keeping an eye out for, and pretty much all of them, with the exception of the Monk and Fox thing, I was given last night, and I was happy about it.
Yeah, they definitely checked a lot of your boxes. Probably checked most boxes that anybody had coming in. It was just a killer game for them in the best way possible. And to start with your point on KZ and him getting that starting lineup, I think after Mike Brown had announced that in pregame, I kind of started to think, I wonder if they're going to throw him on Damian Lillard. We saw him do that with the Nigerian national team when they played Team USA. It was actually that exact same matchup. Lillard was the starting point guard on Team USA in that friendly, and he put Okpala on him. And I just want to highlight the versatility of 6'8", 7'2" wingspan Okpala to go from game one. His primary assignment is a 6'8" LeBron. And then he goes to game two and his primary assignment is Lillard's 6'2", 6'3" at best, and did a solid job on both. Mike Brown pointed out, I thought it was pretty funny. I think the first thing that got asked him in post game was from from Sean Cunningham, and he said something along the lines of, "Hey, it was a pretty perfect game, right? Is there anything you can really feel like you need to still clean up or take from this and need to get better?" And Mike Brown right away, very dead faced, was like, "Oh, there's a lot that we could have done better." And one of the first things he pointed out was fouling. And I think that's one aspect that, while I've really liked Okpala's defense, and I think he's maybe not set the tone, but I think that there is value in putting him out there and making these primary guys uncomfortable at first and pressuring them. He has dealt with foul trouble. In that first game, he only played 10 minutes and picked up 2 fouls in that time. But specifically in that second one against Portland, he only played 12 minutes and ended up with 4 fouls. There was a handful of guys that kind of dealt with some foul trouble, but I think I'll take that with an aggressive defense compared to a very passive one that we kind of saw throughout the course of last year that probably got worse and worse. Do you think that there's moments where Okpala is like borderline unplayable on offense? The defense has a lot of value, but he hasn't hit a 3. He's only taken he took 2 yesterday, and then the game before he took 2. He's not known for his 3-point shooting or anything, but do you think there's moments where that's going to be a really real concern for him?
I don't think unplayable is fair to say at this point, because I also don't think Mike Brown has left him in long enough to where he becomes a detriment, if that makes sense. Like, I learned pretty quickly, and I'm learning this morning, that I have a little bit of the villain argument from last night, because I spent a good amount of time on the Locked On Kings podcast after last night's game talking about how I think it's time to end the KZ Okpala starting experiment. And it's not because of anything that KZ Okpala is necessarily doing wrong. I like what KZ brings defensively. I went into this training camp believing that KZ was going to fight to make the roster. Now I believe he's going to be a consistent part of the Kings rotation and a go-to defender. So, like, I have tremendous respect for what KZ Okpala does. That being said, I feel like we're just delaying the inevitable here. I feel like we're just being a little too cute with things. Like, this is Keegan Murray's spot. Keegan Murray is ready for this moment. Keegan Murray was drafted with the belief, both with his age and his experience, that he was going to be an immediate impact for the Kings, which he already has been, and he will be, whether he comes off the bench or plays as a starter. And that's one thing that, Brendan, I would love to talk to you about later on in the show is, I thought that was a consistency with Keegan Murray, that he seems to fit and play well with whoever he played with. But one thing that jumped off the page to me last night is the Kings, whatever groups were out there, they knew how to play with one another. And it's because of Mike Brown's system. And that was really eye-opening and really encouraging to me. But going back to the Keegan Murray versus KZ Okpala thing, if you want to look at it the same way you look at like a opener in baseball, right? Not a starting pitcher, but someone who comes out, basically sets the tone, gets through the first couple of innings or first couple of batters to make sure there's not a shell shock start for the opposing team, and then gets out of the way, and then the long-term starter kind of comes in. If you want to look at it that way, I understand, because I do think KZ Okpala comes in and does help set a tone defensively. Except when you look at both of these games, 2-game sample size, not nearly enough to make a full-fledged regular season argument, but it's all the context that we have. Both games, Mike Brown has had to take an early timeout in the first quarter because he didn't like what he was seeing on the defensive end of the floor. That's not on KZ Okpala, but my point is, if KZ is in there to set a tone defensively and the team still isn't setting the tone, then at that point, you're like, it's at best neutral value. Versus Keegan Murray comes in, and maybe he's not as versatile of a defender as KZ Okpala is, but I believe Keegan Murray is instant offense. He's instant production. And he can give you that right out of the gate, to where instead of worrying about the other team punching you in the mouth first, maybe you can punch them. Like, I think Keegan Murray is the starter on this Kings team. I think it's only a matter of time. I personally would like to see Mike Brown turn these final 2 preseason games over to Keegan in the starting lineup, to just let that group get used to playing with one another. But regardless, starting lineups are starting lineups. Closing lineups in a close game, I think we all know that Keegan Murray is going to be on the floor in those moments, and that's what matters. But to me, we're just delaying the inevitable here.
Definitely understand where you're coming from. I think most people would probably agree with you. I think it is weirdly Keegan's spot to lose. I mean, Keegan doesn't have it yet, but it feels like his spot. And I think one thing Chris Watkins said at one point, Sactown Sports 1140, is like, maybe there's an aspect of, once you give it to Keegan, you can't take it back exactly. And I guess that you can, but I think that The way the fan base would react might not be amazing. And to your point, like closing is what really matters, right? And this is something Mike Brown even talked about in pregame, that closing games, even closing halves, is what really matters, less than the starters. And I think that as long as Keegan is in the closing lineups, I'm fine. I think that KZ is the best defender on this roster. They don't have very many great defenders on the roster, so take that for what you will. But I do think that KZ is the best one that they have. I think that his aggressiveness on defense, even if that's led to some fouls and could be toned down a little bit, has still been impactful early in games. Like Dame Lillard didn't make a triple last night and ended the game with, was it 4 points, 8 points, on 2 of 10 from the field. Like it's an outlier Dame Lillard night. It's not all just because of KZ, but I think that he had an impact there. And yeah, Keegan's not going to kill you on defense or anything like that. It's not two polar opposites. I actually thought Keegan was pretty solid on defense in this game. He had a couple moments. He got switched on to Damian Lillard and did a lot better than I would have expected defending him in isolation. I do think that there's a clear difference between KZ and Keegan on the defensive end, but there's also a clear difference on the offensive end in Keegan's favor. And it was expected that he was going to be an NBA ready rookie, but I think this is like taking it to the max. For him to come into this game and go 5 of 6 from the field, all from beyond the arc and within the flow of the offense, for 16 points. He pulls down 3 boards as well, an assist thrown in there. I've been happily surprised with his passing in these first 2 games. And then you also get 2 steals and a block in there as well. Like Keegan was just very active. And I think De'Aaron said post game, like you just look up at the scoreboard and you're like, when did Keegan all of a sudden have 16 points? And that's the nature of how he plays. And I think that's such a compliment to him. I'm curious, Matt, as somebody who was really a big Keegan Murray believer and fan of the pick at the time, like, is there anything that's even surprised you from what you've seen?
Oh, absolutely. Like even someone who it was as high on Keegan Murray as I have been, I did not expect Keegan to have this much success right out of the gate. I thought that Keegan was going to be a good fit for this Kings team going forward. I thought that Keegan's consistency and his composure and him being a known commodity was not a negative, but a positive for a Kings team that has struggled so heavily with inconsistencies over the last almost 2 decades. I thought it would be a breath of fresh air. I didn't expect this man to consistently put up the really, really good numbers that he's been putting up. I did not expect Keegan Murray to be a top 5 player on a team with playoff expectations right out of the gate. Like, look, you look at the Orlando Magic, right? And you can say Paolo Banchero might be their best player already, or he's in the mix for top 2, top 3. He's going to put up ridiculous numbers. But there's a difference between being the top player on a team that you know what they are, which is towards the bottom of their conference, and a team in Sacramento that Keegan can honestly be a top 3 player for. We were talking about last night before the game, who's going to be the 3rd leading scorer on this Kings team. I think there's a very big argument for it being Keegan Murray. And that's a team that is looking towards the postseason, who is expecting to make the postseason. And if they were to make the postseason, Keegan would play a massive role in how they fared in the postseason as well. Like there's a big difference in that. So even if I can pat myself on the back and say, man, I felt good about this Keegan Murray pick and I'm glad to be somewhat validated, there's no way that I or anybody who's a Keegan Murray fan can claim that we knew that Keegan was going to have this kind of success. But Brendan, really quickly, I do want to go back to KZ Okpala. Again, not to build an argument against KZ like he's doing anything wrong, because I actually don't think KZ's doing anything wrong. I really don't. I think KZ's been very effective on the defensive end of the floor. But people are pointing to Dame Lillard's slow night. People are pointing to LeBron James's slow night. And KZ started the Lakers game guarding LeBron. The issue that I have with that, while he was impactful and he did help set the tone against those players, KZ Okpala played 5 minutes in the first half last night. He played the first 5 minutes of the game, didn't come back in until it was the second unit midway through the 3rd quarter. Damian Lillard played the majority of his minutes in the first half and struggled offensively. A lot of it was against Kevin Huerter. Some of it was against Keegan Murray. Some of it was against De'Aaron Fox. Like, it's not we can give KZ Okpala credit, but it has to be in comparison to what the other defenders on the team did. I think Dame also kind of had a rough night a little bit. I think the Blazers as a whole had a rough night. So I'm not saying anybody on the Kings or the Kings defense shut down Damian Lillard by any means. But if you're going to say, wow, KZ Okpala did it really good on Damian Lillard because this is the stat line that he put up, you have to recognize that he was a very, very small part of that. And it's the same thing with the Los Angeles Lakers game. KZ Okpala played the first few minutes of that game as well. Didn't play for the rest of the first half because the starters were done at the end of the half. So was LeBron James, but LeBron ended up playing 16 minutes, went 0 of 7 from the field, finished with just 4 points. Some of it against KZ, most of it against the rest of the team. So that's where I look at KZ as a starter and I say I don't see enough of his individual output to suggest that it is more valuable for the Kings out of the gate than Keegan Murray's individual output from start to finish. That's where I'm kind of at with that.
I think the value in KZ's defense, and totally agree with you that like it shouldn't all be credited to KZ, but I think the value in him on this roster defensively is the different options that you can throw at these star players,
Absolutely.
at a Damian Lillard, at a LeBron James. Like the Kings didn't really have options last year. And this year, the fact that Dame Lillard has to first start the game getting used to being covered by this 6'8", 7'2" wingspan. And then later he's being checked by Kevin Huerter, who's got decent size himself, but is going to play defense very differently. And then later you're going to see Davion Mitchell on him. And like, I think the fact that you can just throw different bodies that are going to give these star creators different looks in different, just they have to think a little bit more as they deal with different bodies defensively, I think is where a lot of value is. And I definitely see where you're coming from, and am probably with you about KZ starting, or really more so Keegan starting in place of KZ, because like you said, KZ hasn't done anything wrong. I'm with that as well. I think that if they still want to start him and just so maybe from the jump, the Damian Lillard, LeBron James isn't getting a peak right away at what they're actually going to have to deal with all night, and instead you don't get that look until a little bit later in the game, like that's fine with me, as long as Keegan is closing games, because that's definitely where he should be. And I would expect that Keegan moves into the starting lineup sooner rather than later. It feels pretty hard to not do that. And
I'm glad. Sorry, really quick, Brian. I want to say I'm glad you brought up Davion Mitchell too, because I didn't even mention him. I thought he did an excellent job on Dame last night as well.
He did. He definitely did. I think that maybe he could have. Offensively, he hasn't had a great start to the year, but defensively, he's been as expected, and as expected is one of the best perimeter defenders in the league already going into year two. So, was really happy with what we got from Davion last night for sure. And part of what Keegan has really brought to this group, but not only Keegan, Kevin Huerter, Malik Monk, Terrence Davis playing a little bit more after being out for a large majority of last year, is 3-point shooting. And that was something that was emphasized like crazy going into this offseason and coming into the year. And the Kings end up going 21 of 45 from three. I believe the franchise record was 22 made threes that they did one time last year. So this would have been the second most threes they made an entire game last year. And I think that has to be acknowledged as a little bit of an outlier. The Kings are definitely improved when it comes to shooting. But there is a factor here of the Kings just made a lot of shots. There's going to be nights where a lot go in. They made 22 in one game last year, even though it was a much worse 3-point shooting team. Sometimes shots are just going to fall. And another aspect of that is they had 34 assists on 45 made shots. So they were getting guys open with really, really good ball movement. And I think that 34 assists actually would have been a season high last year as well. I believe their season high last year was 33. So the ball movement was on point. I do think there's partially an aspect of the Blazers not being very good on the perimeter defense, specifically without Gary Payton. I think that's one of the big things that he really brings to that roster. And maybe you throw Justice Winslow in there as well. But how much of last night to you was an outlier of playing a poor perimeter defensive team and a lot of shots going in compared to like, oh, this is really promising moving forward?
I think you're absolutely right about the amount of threes, the 21 threes being an outlier, because last night was a classic case in the NBA of when it rains, it pours. Like everybody had it going. Everybody had the hot hand. And that gave everybody coming into the game confidence that they wanted to join the party. And it was almost polar opposite from how much the Kings struggled from 3-point range against the Los Angeles Lakers. There are going to be nights where this happens for the Kings and we all feel fantastic because the Kings should be blowing out their opponents if they're shooting this well. to me, what jumps more off the page, Brendan, in both these games is the quality of shot that the Kings are getting. Last night, it wasn't just that the Kings were making 21 threes. It's that the vast majority of those 21 threes were really good looks, and they came within the flow of the offense. There were a couple of them, like I remember Kevin Huerter tracking down a long rebound, jogging up the floor, and just pulling up for a three, and he drained. It's like, cool. All right, you're feeling yourself right now. But the majority of threes were De'Aaron Fox coming off curl action, catch and shoot, or just everybody moving the ball around to kick out to an open corner three. Keegan Murray hit his first three just in the flow of the offense. He missed his first three-pointer, and then he hit three straight, all of them off of kickouts, two of them in the exact same spot on the floor, playing two-man game with a big. I don't know if all of it was Domantas Sabonis. I think at some point or one point it was Alex Len as well. Regardless, it was flow. And the flow was opening up a lot of good looks from three-point range that the Kings were hitting. And that's what stood out to me, I think, the most out of anything in this preseason thus far, Brendan, is the fact that the Kings know what to do on offense. Like, they're still trying to push the tempo. They're still trying to play fast. I think they had 22 fast break points last night. But they're not relying on the fast break nearly as heavily as they did in 2018, right? When they were just running people out of gyms and it was get the ball and everybody sprint and beat everybody down the floor. This time they're still moving fast. Domantas Sabonis took the ball off the floor a few times. De'Aaron Fox took the ball off the floor. Davion Mitchell was pushing the tempo. Everybody, as soon as they get that rebound, they're going, and Mike Brown is yelling at them to go. But it's not head down, full on sprint, everybody get to the basket. It's run with a purpose. Everybody move, get to an open spot, and find the right shot. And the Kings were doing that last night. And that's why they were rewarded with so many makes and so many assists. The fact that this team has played 2 games together, if you're looking at the training camp roster, you see 10 of 20 guys have never played on this team before. And 2 of them, at least 2, there might be more, Domantas Sabonis, Trey Lyles, only joined the team at the trade deadline last season. There might be another one that I'm blanking on, Brennan. Help me out if I am. But you have over half your roster that has barely played together. And in 2 games, your assist to turnover ratio has been phenomenal. Now, the Kings did turn the ball over 20 times last night, which is way too many turnovers. But when you have 34 assists, it numbs that pain a little bit. The fact that this team has played so well together, there's been such cohesiveness, there's been camaraderie on the offensive end of the floor, regardless of who's on the floor. A lot of that I credit to how hard these players are working and how much they're paying attention. But you have to give a lot of love and a lot of credit to Coach Brown and his staff for putting together a system that clearly, even after just 2 weeks of training camp, everyone knows what's expected of them. And where that jumps off the page to me is not just role players who come in and are effective. It's De'Aaron Fox playing on the ball versus De'Aaron Fox playing off the ball. Last season, when De'Aaron Fox was playing off the ball because Tyrese Halliburton was here, Fox just stood in the corner because he had no idea what the hell to do. Walton never gave him anything. Gentry never gave him anything. They had no idea. This year, De'Aaron knows what to do when he's off the ball because it's the same thing that the other guards are expected to do when he is on the ball. I like that consistency. That is the biggest difference that I've seen from Mike Brown and from the Kings this season so far.
Their offense, I've been kind of asking a lot of questions on how comfortable guys feel going into this and just how easy or maybe difficult to some guys it is to learn this free-flowing offense and just kind of reading and reacting. And there's a lot of chemistry involved, right? And I think the way that you're pointing out, this team already looks like they have phenomenal, I should slow down a little bit, but really solid chemistry, all things considered, with the turnover that you highlighted as well, I think is really promising. And that's probably a factor of a lot of these guys being here throughout the course of the offseason. We heard a lot about that these guys spent a lot of time together throughout the course of the offseason. Not everybody, obviously, Sabonis being the big one missing there since he was playing over in Eurobasket. But most people say playing with him is pretty easy, and he's just going to reward you for doing the right thing, which makes sense out there. And to the point of pace, because Mike Brown is still screaming his ass off. It's very Jaeger, Walton, Gentry, like we've seen it with everyone. He's screaming when they get a board to run in transition. But to your point, it's not running to just go straight to the basket. It's running to go get in your set. That way they have as much time as possible to try and create a good look. And I think that they're also playing the margins on the other end. Like KZ Okpala, Donovan Mitchell are picking up Damian Lillard, Anthony Simons, whoever the initiator is, full court. So that way the other team has as little time as possible to run their offense. Like Mike Brown is playing these margins, and He's talked about paying close attention to detail a lot. The other area that they've been playing margins is the rebounding game. And we saw last year the Kings were one of the worst rebounding teams in the league, especially until Domantas Sabonis gets there. Now Sabonis gets there, and I think he finished third in rebounds per game last year with 12, almost 13 a game. It wouldn't surprise me if he finished as the league leader in rebounds this year, considering Sacramento's roster. But last year, 27th in rebounds per game for the Kings and 21st in offensive rebounds per game with 9.5 a game. And Mike Brown said post-game that, quote, "It's one of the things that me and the organization are emphasizing. We're all big in the offensive rebounding category from Monty on down. We feel like coming up with extra possessions in this league can be really helpful. And we have some long athletic guys that are capable of hitting that glass and hitting the glass the right way. We just want to make sure we don't get beat in transition when we do it," end quote. I thought it was really interesting to hear him say from the top on down. And I think that McNair's a guy that coming out of Houston was really accredited for kind of being a middleman and communicator between the front office and the coaching staff. And Mike Brown being Monty McNair's hire, when maybe that wasn't the case with Luke Walton, there seems to be a continuity among this group. And the rebounding emphasis, I think, is something that's great. Obviously, 54-49 on the boards in that first game against a Lakers team that has a lot of size. And then in that second game, they end up with 47 boards to 29 of Portland. I don't even think I realized until right now, 29 boards only is crazy for Portland. And Sacramento had 13 offensive rebounds. Mike Brown highlighted the 3 that HB had. There were also two from Domas, 2 from Trey Lyles, 2 from Alex Len, and then you got 1 from Dellavedova, Davis, Keita, and Fox as well. Playing the rebounds is something that is obviously going to be very beneficial for the Kings, but I'm curious how they strike this balance. It's honestly something that's caught me off guard because I thought Mike Brown would be a guy of like, we need to sprint back in transition. But if they can figure out this balance of doing that, not getting beat in transition and still crashing the glass, like that could be a really big plus for this team moving forward.
I think that's a kind of school of Steve Kerr and the Golden State Warriors in a lot of ways too, because the Golden State Warriors always seem to know how to get those back-breaking offensive rebounds and second chance opportunities, especially late in games when winning time mattered. Like they were such a hard team to stop defensively, and the Sacramento Kings can be a very difficult team to stop defensively. That when you do force them to miss a shot or force them into a bad shot and they get a fresh 14 and they can set up and do it again, it's demoralizing for any defense who has to go to war for 24 seconds initially just to have a chance to get out in transition and get back into the game on the other end of the floor. So I think there's a mental side of that too, to where not only are there more points to be grabbed, there are more rebounds to be grabbed, there are more opportunities because of offensive rebounds, but it's a chance to, in some ways, take the wind out of your sails just as much as a big time 3 or a transition bucket, not allowing a defense or rather an offense to get set. Like it to me, there's that aspect of things as well. And I like what you said about Monty McNair and Coach Brown, because like their cohesion, their cohesiveness, it couldn't be more obvious from day one. I mean, with the amount of players that the Kings have brought in training camp wise that were former Mike Brown guys or former guys on the Nigerian national team, KZ Okpala, Chima Maneke, Chimezi Metu was already here, Matthew Dellavedova from his time in Cleveland, Quinn Cook from his time in Golden State. Like they have been on the same page. And I know I've shared this before. Like this is the most confident, and I've said this throughout the summer, this is the most confident and most comfortable that I've seen Monty McNair at any point during his Kings tenure. Some of that could be because he's really finally now in year 3 grown into the position and feels like he really has his feet underneath him. But I also think he has his head coach here. No disrespect to Luke Walton or Alvin Gentry, but he has his coach here, the one that he selected, and both of them agree on what the best path is going forward. And he completely trusts that Mike Brown is going to make the decisions that make sense for both of them, that check the boxes for both of them, even if he does not have to whisper in Mike Brown's ear and tell Mike what the front office wants. Like they're on the same page. And that shows already in how these 2 preseason games are gone. And that is a breath of fresh air, considering even over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the conflict and the disconnect that the Kings have had at times between their coaching staff and front office.
One of the other things that stood out to me throughout both of these games, noticed it right away when they were playing the Lakers, that Mike Brown was really quick to call timeouts and
Yes.
correct things.
Yes.
And we saw more of the same in game 2 against Portland. And obviously it stood out to you as well. You asked, I think, Terrence Davis, but also Mike Brown about these quick timeouts. And yeah, you were the one to ask those questions. What stood out to you in those responses?
Yeah, well, the fact that in the first, second, and third quarters, Brown took timeouts within the first 2 minutes in every single quarter. And after those timeouts, all three of them, the Kings made adjustments. They didn't look loads better. They didn't suddenly remember how to all like play basketball, but Mike was not afraid to use his timeout to say, I know we just had a break. I know we just had a halftime. I know we just talked things over, but you're not doing what I wanted you to do. Let's refocus and let's get this right. Like, and the fact that he's doing that in preseason, I expect him to do that in regular season as well. And this kind of got on my radar in the Lakers game because Sacramento got off to the really bad start. I think they were down 12-3 at the start of the Laker game. He called a timeout. And then after the Lakers started the game 5 of 7 from the field, they went 2 of their next 10 shots. Like, and that allowed the Kings to kind of get back into it. It was a 5-point game at halftime. And then we know how the second half went. Like, to me, that's very indicative of who Mike Brown is as a head coach. I'm going to correct these mistakes right now. I'm going to coach you right now. I'm not going to wait to call a timeout when we're on the wrong end of an 8 or 9-0 run. And I asked Mike Brown about his philosophy of saving timeouts versus using timeouts. And I like what Mike said. It was really kind of the only time he had a cheeky Mike Brown grin. He basically said, look, like, I could save all my timeouts and we can be getting our ass kicked. Or if I see something wrong, I'm going to use my timeouts and I'm going to correct it. I love that approach. It's simple and it makes sense because whether or not you like to play or care about the timeout game, it's like it's more of a big thing in football than it is in basketball when coaches use their 3 timeouts in the NFL and how to use them strategically and how to save them for the end of a half or something like that, or the end of a game. Mike Brown's like, I'm not going to worry about saving him for the end of the game because by the end of the game, I expect to be up 20, 30 points because I'm going to nip this in the bud right now. And he did that not once, not twice, in 3 out of the 4 quarters. I love to see that. And it makes me more excited to see that and less worried about the fact that he had to do that 3 times with, in general, the same groups.
I'm a fan. I like the philosophy for sure. I love the questions that you asked in the follow up of that you mentioned of like, well, do you worry about not having enough timeouts later in the game? And Mike's response that you pointed out of, listen, if we don't correct this shit, late game isn't going to matter anyways.
Right.
And one of the quotes that I pulled from Brown in the initial part when you asked that question was, quote, it's part of my job to make sure that there's no detail that's too small for us. And I think they appreciate that at the end of the day, end quote. And to me, this is just like what setting a culture and holding guys accountable looks like. It's tiny details that if you nip it in the bud right away, that you can just limit the amount of mistakes that you're making throughout the course of a game. I think one of them was they were in too deep of a drop on like a Simons pick and roll, and he hit a pull-up 3. And then from there was, okay, Domas, you're going to play a lot higher on that screen. And we saw him take that shot away. There was one that Malik Monk got beat back door, and it looked like he probably got a talking to right afterwards. There was one, we talked to Terrence Davis. I think you asked him a similar question about these timeouts, and I think your wording was, don't give away any secrets, but can you kind of tell us what that was like when coach was getting into you? And TD mentioned he came out there and he had 3 possessions that he made mistakes, and he walked through the 3 mistakes, which is also a little different, by the way. I
Yes,
thought for
very.
TD to sit there and say, this is what I did wrong. This is what I did wrong. This is what I did wrong. And coach said, the quote that I have pulled from TD was, quote, he, being coach, is going to let you know if you're out of order. He has high expectations for all of us. Anytime you don't meet that standard, he's going to let you know for sure, end quote. And I think that we've seen Mike Brown hold guys accountable a lot, and it's everyone. Like, we saw him have a conversation with De'Aaron Fox at one point. He had a foul. He called him over in the middle of Portland shooting free throws and have a conversation. And like having that expectation and level of accountability for everyone top down when it comes to roster, I think for himself and the rest of his coaching staff, the front office, like, to me, this is what setting a culture looks like.
And what I love about that too is Terrence says that with a smile, and De'Aaron says it with a smile. I remember we talked to Steph Curry at the American Century Link Celebrity Golf Championship in Tahoe when Mike was hired, and Steph said with a smile, like, "There's going to be accountability. He's going to hold you accountable." Like that to me is the epitome of Mike Brown. Mike Brown can be a hard ass and get on you when he needs to. We saw in practice him pull Davion Mitchell in front of the entire team and coach him in front of the entire team, hold him accountable. And he wasn't blaming Davion. And I think after that moment, if I'm not mistaken, Malik Monk walked up to him as they were walking to the baseline to do their free throws or run sprints drill. And Malik also said, "It's not just on you, it's on all of us." Like to me, that's the difference between a player's coach and a respected coach. Like Mike Brown compared to Luke Walton is night and day difference. And I liked Luke Walton. A lot of players liked Luke Walton. He got kind of a bad rap here. I don't think he got a completely fair shake here in Sacramento. The Kings made a massive mistake by not firing him last offseason and waiting as long as they did. Whatever, that's in the past. My point is, when the Kings hired Luke Walton, there was all this talk about how he is a player's coach compared to Dave Yeager. But there was no accountability with Walton, or when he tried to hold players accountable, it fell through. Like with Buddy Hield, for example, he benched Buddy Hield, had a really short leash with Buddy Hield at times, didn't like his shot selection. Suddenly that turned into Buddy Hield has the green light and can do anything he wants. Like that's what it became pretty quickly. Versus Mike Brown, it's like, no, I'll call you out, I'll pull you out, I will get in you, but you respect me enough to listen. And that's what jumps off the page is Terrence Davis clearly takes what Mike Brown has to say to heart. De'Aaron Fox clearly takes what Mike Brown has to say to heart. Now, I want to see this tested over the course of a year. I still really want to see, Brendan, what this team looks like and how they respond when they do finally get punched in the mouth, because there's going to be a night where either offensively or defensively, this team is awful. There's going to be a time where they're in a game where they're on the wrong end of like a 10-0 run. And there's going to be a time where in the season, maybe they're on a 2 or 3 game losing streak. How do they respond to that? Does Mike Brown lose his charm a little bit, or do they still believe in him and buy into what he's saying and come through that tunnel together? Like I'm very interested to see that, because of course, even with this team looking as good as they've looked in 2 preseason games, we know that this is a team that's going to be battling for one of the bottom playoff spots in the Western Conference. This is not a team that's going to be vaulted into the top of the Western Conference conversation just because of how great and how happy they are in training camp.
I'm glad you pointed out how much all these guys seem to appreciate and just be on board with the criticism and like detail fixing that Mike Brown is clearly doing all the time, because nobody's taking it personally, kind of like you're pointing out. And it seems like it's happening with every single player. It happens from the top down, and it's happening for the purpose of not singling someone out, but listen, we all need to be doing all these things right if we want to win as many games as possible, which is what we're all here for. So I think that they all understand that there's the same goal in mind, and there does feel a bit like there's some continuity. But as you pointed out, we're going to need to see how they respond to adversity, something that Mike Brown has highlighted as well. Like, it's expected, it's going to happen at some point, and no team doesn't deal with that at some point. And that's when you really find out the character of a team. So we're going to have to wait and see. One of the final things I want to touch on here before we get out of here is just some of like notes on the rotation. And this is probably going to be overreactions, to be honest, because we're still dealing with a two preseason game sample size, but it's what we're working with. So I think it's notable to kind of highlight a couple things. I think that Terrence Davis playing over Trey Lyles in that second unit was interesting. To me, it could be a function of it just being a smaller team that the Kings were up against. Big size difference between Portland and LA. Portland does a lot of 3-guard lineups. So a bench unit being Davion Mitchell, Malik Monk, Terrence Davis, and then Keegan Murray at the 4. And then it was Alex Len at the 5 because Rashawn Holmes was unavailable. There was also moments that Chimezie Metu played the 5, and he almost seemed to be like the 3rd string center before they looked to Keita for a little while, which is something that Mike Brown teased a little bit coming into this game. But I would think that that's just a function of Holmes not being available. I don't think it's something we'll see all too often down the line. And then the 3 guys that did not play were, outside of Holmes, who was unavailable, obviously, were Chima Moneke, Quinn Cook, and Sam Merrill. And I think that's of note. There's 3 guys that are going to have to be cut from this roster before the start of the regular season. And honestly, those are three guys that would make a lot of sense. I feel like Sam Merrill has, no disrespect to Sam, I kind of feel like he's the 20th guy on this roster. And then after, it seems like we've had conversations about Quinn Cook versus Matthew Dellavedova. To me, that feels like one of the cuts, Cook or Dellavedova. And I think it's notable that Delly is playing over Cook last night. And then you could see Monecki being the odd guy out. There's like a Monecki, Bazemore sort of. Trey Lyles is maybe in this conversation. I'm sorry, Chimezie Metu is maybe in this conversation of who is that final cut. But I thought it was interesting that those three guys didn't play. I know you mentioned like Fox and Monk not playing much together. If you want to talk about that, or is there any other rotation stuff that stood out to you last night?
No, I'm on the same page as a lot of your observations too, because when Mike shared with us that he's going to cut his rotations down to 13, 15 guys, and even last night, I think what did he end up playing? 17, right? So I think his rotation was even bigger than he expected, mostly because the Kings were beating the living crap out of the Trailblazers, and he could afford to empty the bench at that point. I think maybe he was planning on playing his 8 to 10 guy rotation a little bit more than even what they did. So it does seem that I think there's two easy cuts to make at this point. I think it's Quinn Cook and Sam Merrill. I'm a fan of Chima Moneke, the personality. I don't really know much about Chima Moneke, the player, other than the highlights that I've seen of him overseas and, of course, his time at UC Davis. I don't know if maybe there's a future for him in Stockton with the Stockton Kings, and we get an opportunity to see what he can do there. But I have wanted to see a little bit more of him, and I'm a little disappointed that we haven't seen that. Like Keon Ellis and Nemias Cato, we know are two-way guys, so no matter what their playing time looks like, we know what they're doing. And I think Keon had a nice little 360 or reverse dunk at the end of the game. And I actually talked to Keon briefly in the locker room as he was leaving. And I asked him, I was like, "Can you see the intro videos from when you're sitting on the bench during or standing in the tunnel during lineups?" And he said, "Yeah, I can kind of see it, but not really." And I was like, "Did you see the intro video that they played before, like they showed it, or was that your first time seeing it?" He's like, "No, that was my first time seeing it." I was like, "Then what do you think about you literally being the first face on the screen during that intro?" Like, and I don't know if I'm guessing TV audiences or internet audiences or whatever didn't see it, but for those in attendance, like they always do phenomenal intro videos. This one had a very like training camp vibe to it, guys lifting weights and going through drills and just putting in the work. And the first face on the screen is Keon Ellis at media day, which I was like, cool. I like it. I like Keon. So I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but just something that was fun that stood out to me. And Keon's a great personality too. So
You don't have to apologize for a Keon Ellis tangent.
I don't know if I read too far into really anything. I want to see Chima Moneke more, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's the cut. And then, of course, I want to see Malik Monk and De'Aaron Fox more together. I wonder if that's something that Mike Brown is saving for the regular season, or like Kevin Huerter has been so good and De'Aaron and Kevin Huerter have played so well together that maybe that's just going to be the backcourt partnership for the majority. And Malik is going to be that volume scorer, which he hit like back-to-back deep threes at one point in the third quarter. And I tweeted out, like, watch out, this guy can get going in a hurry. And then Terrence Davis hit like back-to-back threes. And then Trey Lyles hit back-to-back threes. So just the depth of this roster is so exciting as well. That's really what stood out to me.
I would like to see more Chima also, but I feel like it's somewhat selfishly in a way. I feel like for all of us, we haven't seen enough Chima.
100%.
But I'm sure that they have behind closed doors throughout the course of this training camp. And prior to that, you know, they have pre-built relationships with Chima. I think Chima has a decent relationship with Jordi Fernandez that he's highlighted, and obviously with Mike Brown as well. So I think I'm going to trust their opinion on Chima, but I would love to see more of him in the context of this game for sure. Also wouldn't surprise me if he was one of the three eventual cuts, but we'll have to wait and see. I think that Fox and Huerter and then Monk and Mitchell work really well as pairings. I think those two duos make a lot of sense together, and that could be something that we see. Those pairings kind of stick together. There was also, because I guess since I pointed out in game one, there was no staggering of Fox or Sabonis. They did stagger those guys in this game. I think kind of as expected. I think that's going to be something that we see throughout the course of the year. Not very many moments where neither one of them are on the floor. And I think that's what we saw until they both ended up not playing midway through the third quarter is kind of when they ended up sitting.
Sabonis played really well, by the way. When Fox was out of the game at the end of the first quarter and early second quarter, Sabonis really stepped up. That's when he had his big dunk off the Davion Mitchell pick and roll. And he scored like 6 or 7 points during that stretch, too, which I think is going to be really important. So it was good to see Sabonis kind of say, okay, after touching the ball all 5 possessions and just handing off to guards, like this is my opportunity to really get going. The team needs me to score in these moments. So it was good to see him step up in that way, too, even if it's a very small sample size.
You talked about Keegan just kind of casually putting up numbers. I mean, Domas does the same thing. Like,
yes, he does.
23 minutes, and it's like, oh, this guy had 13 points, 7 boards, and 4 assists on 4 of 8 from the field. Like, he just very casually is effective and impactful. I thought he's been pretty solid defensively. I haven't felt like there's been a moment throughout the course of these games where I'm like, oh man, the Kings are really hurting from not having any rim protection on this team. I thought the rotations have been pretty solid. And it's a team effort, but Domas being the backline of that defense, I thought he's done a pretty solid job. And then I guess my last takeaway before we get out of here, Matt, is in an overreaction to this being the only Portland game I've seen so far, team does not look great. They could not shoot to save their life. And the depth, I think, was a known issue because after Dame and Simons and their starting 5 is solid of Lillard, Simons, Grant, Hart, and Nurkic. I think that 5 is really solid. I think that when you have your bench then being Nasir Little, Gary Payton, after that, I don't know who you're relying on. You know, like can Keon Johnson or Shaden Sharp or Justice Winslow become okay parts of your rotation? I don't really know. Like, this is a team that Sacramento's probably, in my mind, this is who they're competing with for that 10 spot, one of the teams that they're in the same tier as. And I thought it was interesting to get a first look at them, and they honestly looked horrible.
Yeah, I think they're going to look better on open night, significantly better. Maybe Dame is just going to say, you know what, damn it, I'm going to do it all myself. I was disappointed with Shaden Sharp, to be honest with you. Like, I just wanted to see a little bit more, and he played really, really well in his initial, like, Trailblazers debut. I think it was his debut, and it might have been against, like, Maccabi Haifa or something. But he looked really good in that game, and I wanted to see more of Sharp, but he barely played except for the second half. He did have, like, 8 points in like 13 minutes or something like that. I don't have the box score open in front of me. So he did fine, but the main takeaway that I had, and this isn't surprising, but like you compare Keegan Murray to Shaden Sharp and it's like night and day difference. But I also expected that because Sharp is significantly younger than Murray. Sharp has barely played over the last 2 years. Keegan Murray was arguably one of the best players, if not the best player in college basketball last year. So it's to me a reminder, again, not an I told you so thing, but a reminder that the Kings made the absolute right choice for their circumstance. They got a guy that's going to be an immediate impact player who I remember some people rolling their eyes when Monty McNair said they thought he was the best talent available at number 4. So far, all indicators point to they were onto something there. And I was of the same belief at that time too, even if I expect Jaden Ivey to have a great career, even if I think Shaden Sharp's going to have a great career as well. Like I think, and I tweeted this out last night, as good of numbers as Paulo Banchero is going to put up for the Magic, as good of numbers as maybe Jabari Smith Jr. is going to put up for the Houston Rockets at times. Like I think at some point during this season, Keegan Murray is going to be the favorite to win Rookie of the Year. And it's not just because of the numbers that he's putting up. It's going to be the fact because he's putting up numbers on a winning team or a significantly improved team. And that to me is the difference. So when I watch Shaden Sharp play and him kind of just look like, okay, I don't really know what to do. I'm just going to get mine. And here I am, ho-hum, versus Keegan Murray. Every time he's in the game, there's a purpose there and there's a reliance upon him to hit those open shots. Like that jumps off the page to me too.
It's hard to deny that Keegan was the right pick for their context. I was notably not, it's not who I would have taken. And I think for their goal that Keegan is clearly been the right pick. And I hate that we still have to have this asterisk of it's just preseason and we had to have the whole, it's just summer league. I can't wait to not have this asterisk anymore because everything he's doing feels like it's going to translate. I don't think there's any reason to think that these are outlier scenarios that we're dealing with Keegan or anything like that, all within the flow of the offenses we've talked about. And I think this is just what he does and what he is. So I think that it absolutely is looking like the right pick for Monty McNair in that front office. And Keegan is going to be a seamless fit on this team now and moving forward. And we'll see how much he's asked upon and if he can be a real part of that rookie of the year conversation like we kind of expect him to. But any final thoughts before we get out of here, Matt?
I'm looking forward to the game against Phoenix to see still what is consistent and what is not. And then what are we, 9 days away now from the actual home opener against the Blazers? So I was pretty pleased and impressed with the crowd at the Golden One Center last night. They always make good noise. I'm expecting a very, very, very sold out, hyped, excited arena for that home opener. So I mean, my impatience was at least I got some relief last night with actually watching Kings basketball, but man, I can't wait for these games to really count because I think Sacramento, even with their difficult start to the season, I think Sacramento is ready to turn some heads right out of the gate.
I'm antsy. I'm ready to get this going too. I had a really good time being back at Golden One yesterday. And I'm sure most of the fans did too that were in the building. It was hard not to, for sure. It was a good opening night. When it comes to preseason, hopefully they can replicate some of the same opening night when they play the same Blazers roster at the start of the regular season and throughout the course of the year as they try to end this playoff drought. But everyone listening, that is Matt George, as I'm sure everyone's aware, but anyone not, at Matt George Sack on Twitter of ABC10 and the Locked On Kings podcast. Check out all the work from myself and all the other great guys and gals at the Kings Herald and take a look at their Patreon to support local independent Kings coverage. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Kings Pulse podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review, and hear from me again in the next couple days.